For joining us. This is the event on clean energy and commodity exports as an opportunity for fossil fuel-rich economies. And so that's convened and presented by the Australian National University in partnership with the Iran Renewable Energy Association. Thanks very much for joining us, and we have nigh on 80 minutes to really get into the depth of this. We'll do that by way of a series of very short introductions by our esteemed panel of speakers here, and then by way of a conversation in the group, in the room here. So my name is Frank Jotzo. I'm with the Australian National University, and one of the things I do there is to lead the Zero Carbon Energy for Asia and the Pacific initiative. Now, I'll introduce our speakers from left to right. We start with my colleague, Dr. Fiona Beck, who's an associate professor at the Australian National University School of Engineering. We then have Dr. Mousavi, Dr. Syed Mousavi, who's a faculty member at the Iranian Research Organization for Science and Technology. We then have Mr. Mohammad Fardat, who's the CEO of Aras Silicon Industries in Iran. We have Dr. Manal Shahabi, who's an associate faculty member at the University of Oxford, research associate with the ANU, as well as director of SHEAR Research and Advisory. We've got Dr. Chris Bataille, who's an adjunct research fellow at Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy, and we've got Dr. Stefan Kalbecken, who's research director with Cicero in Norway, the Center for International Climate Research there. Now, each speaker will have about 5 minutes or so just to set the scene and get into some of these issues on the broader topic of how fossil fuel-rich economies can thrive on the way to net zero, and then we'll have a conversation in the room. But just before we get started with that, this will be my only chance to share some thoughts, so please let me do that. So, of course, you know, phasing down versus phasing out of fossil fuels, such a big topic here at COP, this COP and previous COPs as well, possibly into the future as well. The fact is, of course, that fossil fuel use will be declining and declining sharply if the world is to be on a track to below 2 degrees. Reminding you of the IEA latest World Energy Outlook projections, total coal use declines by 74% from now till 2050 in the announced pledges scenario, and by 91% in the net zero scenario. Not quite as dramatic for oil and gas, but still very significant. Oil and gas combined decline by 39% under the IEA announced pledges scenario till 2050, and 71% under net zero. That includes, of course, abated use of fossil fuels. Now, already investment in clean energy technologies every year is much larger than ongoing investment in fossil fuel equipment and infrastructure. Now, the economic value at stake is, of course, enormous, in particular in a small number of countries that are where global fossil fuel production as well as exports is in fact concentrated. I point you to the this year's production gap report led by the Stockholm Environment Institute. They're tallying up plans and projections by governments in major fossil fuel producing countries to see how that relates to the projections or scenarios towards net zero, or in fact even just announced pledges and policies. Now, when we tally up, when the production gap report tallies up all of the projections and announced plans by fossil fuel producing countries, that implies an increase, in fact, an increase in total fossil fuel energy between now and 2050, right? And so then a gradual decline, increase till 2030, then a gradual decline to 2050 at levels that are similar to present or a bit above that. The anticipated reduction in those government plans and policies comes entirely from coal. Plans and policies by oil and gas producing countries have output of oil and gas actually increasing. So there's a clearly stark disconnect with scenarios for staying below 2 degrees. So that would also indicate that these plans and projections, by and large, greatly overstate likely future production levels. That can be understandable in a sense, because that's, of course, a very difficult nut to crack, or even before you crack the nut, a difficult topic to address in fossil fuel rich economies, where that sector can account for a significant share of GDP as well as tax income, and where is question of economic and social transition as well. But fossil fuel producing countries, by and large, of course, have options. The principal option, of course, being economic diversification, right? Just because we're in energy production, we don't always need to be in energy production. And very importantly, there's also options in the energy sector, in the industrial sector more broadly. The key here, as it's generally seen, is to build on existing comparative advantage and translate that into new energy and energy-related industries. So one, of course, is manufacturing and operation of clean energy installations. Our colleagues from Iran will discuss development of wind power and solar power industry in that regard. Another potentially even larger opportunity is to get into clean energy industries. So that's both clean fuels as well as energy-intensive commodities using renewable energy. In Australia, for example, there's now a very big dream of the Australian economy becoming what our government terms the renewable energy superpower. My university would tend to prefer a term like a powerhouse or something like that, not necessarily a superpower out of a global mid-power. The idea here, in brief, is that renewable energy potential is abundant. All of these things are true for many of the global fossil fuel producers. And so you could make electrolysis at extremely large scale, land availability, really practically unlimited ports, resource industry expertise, open investment and trade framework, stable political system, right? And so you can use that hydrogen to make synthetic fuels, green ammonia, green methanol, green aviation fuels, fertilizers, whatever you want. You can also use that hydrogen to potentially make green iron and green steel. So we will hear from several of our speakers on these options. Fiona on Australia and all of the things I just mentioned. Manal Shahabi on options on Gulf states, including clean hydrogen and economic transition and diversification. Chris Bataille on technology options for splitting processes in metals and in chemicals, some applications to Canada and other countries, I believe. Our colleagues from Iran on wind and solar, respectively, and Steffen Kalbecken on Norway's opportunities as well as recommendations of Norway's net zero commission for fossil fuel phase down. We'll start with my colleague Fiona Beck. Fiona, it's over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for coming to listen to this. So, how are the slides? Excellent. Apologies. So as it stands, Australia is responsible for a great deal of I will continue talking. So at the moment, Australia is a major exporter of coal, both thermal and metallurgical, iron ore, metals, other metal ores, including bauxite, which we use for aluminium, and of course, liquid natural gas. Australia domestically, because of our relatively small population, has a very small greenhouse gas emissions, somewhere in the region of 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, if you look at what we send out into the world, our gas, our coal, our iron ores, these get processed and burnt primarily in our trading partner countries in Asia Pacific. And combined, these actually represent a really significant quantity of global emissions. Up to 5% of global emissions, including land use, come from energy commodities that originated in Australia. And that actually accounts for up to 11% of the emissions in Asia Pacific. So that is a really significant number, and it just shows the opportunity and potentially the responsibility that Australia has to help decarbonize not only ourselves, but our region. So I believe my slides are actually up now, so you can all tell me if I got all my numbers right. But I do believe that the point stands, that our domestic emissions in Australia are absolutely dwarfed by our consequential emissions that are released by processing our commodities that we send to our trading partners. If you change the slide, please. Aha, amazing. No, I don't. There we go. Apologies. So what does a world look like in the net zero, in the future when we have a net zero economy? Well, here I've just briefly put up two maps of the world showing the solar and wind potential. These are freely available maps that come from the global atlases, a great resource. And they're there to highlight how different the energy distribution globally is going to be once we are relying on renewable energy as our primary fuel source rather than fossil fuels. So in a renewable world, we're going to see renewable energy being produced close to centres where it is going to be heavily used. And we may also see transmission of renewable energy in some form from where it is very cheap and plentiful to other places where it's not. Hydrogen and its derivatives, like ammonia, are going to be could be very, very important in moving this energy around, but more importantly, in replacing coal, oil, and liquid natural gas in a range of industrial processes, including very heavy transport and as feedstock and fuels. In particular, we're going to see energy-intensive commodities being produced in areas where we have this abundant renewable energy resource. And we could see quite a shift in the global supply chains due to this point. My final point here is that we will also see mining and processing of iron ores and other commodities happening onshore in the countries with those very high energy resources. So hydrogen and derivatives are, I've mentioned before, this is a concept that is sometimes called power to X. So it allows renewable energy to be the primary energy resource, primary energy source for a range of feedstocks, chemicals, and fuels. So we would start with renewable energy, go through an electrolysis step powered by renewable energy, to create hydrogen, which can then be combined with either nitrogen to form ammonia or carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to form a whole range of hydrocarbons that we currently get from the petrochemical industry based on fossil fuels that are absolutely critical for a whole range of chemicals and industries. So replacing these with renewable energy resources are really going to require hydrogen as a missing link. So Australia in particular has a natural advantage here. We have a large amount of land. We have relatively small energy needs ourselves due to our small population compared to our land. And we have a whole bunch of other advantages like existing trading relationships, stable economic systems, and governance. I've also mentioned iron ore. You may have heard of the term green metals. This is the concept of using renewable energy to mine and also produce metals, metal ores. So at the moment, steel making accounts for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's a very large number. And Australia is one of the largest producers of iron ore. And we export most of that where it is processed mainly in China. In particular, our Pilbara region in Western Australia, you can see it up there in the map, that collection of little blue dots. That's where we have a large number of our iron ore mines. We also have fantastic wind and solar resources there and large land areas sitting right next to ports. There's a real opportunity there to start splitting the process, changing the way that we think about processing iron ores into steel. For example, making green iron in Australia using our green hydrogen and our renewable energy where it can be made very cheaply, and then shipping this green iron into potentially traditional steel-making regions where it can be further processed into steel. So finally, as a sort of counterpart to that first slide I showed you about its current emission profile from our exports, our renewable energy exports could look very different. We could be exporting, for example, electricity directly by high voltage DC cable. We could be producing and exporting hydrogen and also producing green metals onshore. To do this, our calculations have shown we're going to need something like 27 times Australia's current annual electricity generation. So that is a huge number that we need to think about very carefully. That is going to come from 2.4 terawatts of co-located wind and solar, a very large percentage of the current global renewable energy capacity that's deployed. But the point here is that Australia has the natural advantages to make this work. Doing this would only account for 2% of Australia's land mass. And potentially, and if you think about that in terms of what's already been done on the land, that's about 4% of the area that's currently being used for livestock grazing in Australia. However, before I hand over to my colleagues, I would like to make the point very strongly that this is not empty land there for the taking. First Nations communities in Australia hold legal interests to a lot of the land that is going to be prime real estate for large-scale renewable industries. And there is a real need for policy reform so that we don't remake the mistakes of the extractive industries and allow our First Nations communities to benefit from the economic development that this represents. So thank you very much, and apologies for my problems with my slides at the beginning. I'll hand over.
Yeah, so that's the beautiful vision for Australia's renewable energy export future, and on to Iran, Dr. Wasabi.
In the name of God, is it open or not? Yes. In the name of God, thank you very much for invitation and coming to this panel. I think that it would be so useful panel, you know, for oil-dependent economies and countries. For the first time, I want to give you an overview about energy systems in Iran, and after that, I try to describe and explain energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies in Iran, God willing. I don't know, I can't see the presentation here. Is it possible to bring my presentation? I am from Iran Renewable Energy Association and also Iranian Research Organization for Science and Technology. You know, Iran Renewable Energy Association is, yes, thank you. Iran Renewable Energy Association is a non-governmental organization which active for promoting renewable energies, especially wind and solar in my country, by doing, you know, some activities like capacity building and public awareness, and providing platform, you know, for networking between all industries, actors from government and universities. And also we organize some conferences annually, especially in renewable energy, and organize Iran Renewable Energy Awards for promoting renewable energy among the actors in Iran, and also policy research and developing some technology roadmap, especially in wind and solar also. and we have some international communication with IRENA, ISA, and some other international organization for promoting renewable energy in Iran. Okay, if I want to tell you about the energy systems in Iran for the first time, I focus just in electricity sector. If you look at this picture, okay. If you look at this picture, total capacity installed in Iran was about 90 gigawatts, you know, and you see that more than 73% of from natural gas with the gas turbine, and also 50% from the oil and other kind of the oils, and 10% hydropower, and less than 2% nuclear and non-hydro renewables. But in our energy systems, we faced with big challenges for developing renewable energies. One of them is the subsidies of energy systems, near to $50 billion. We pay to all, residential, industrial, agricultural consumptions. Also, the price of household electricity is so cheap, and also household gas. You see that's near to $0.35 per kilowatt hour. It's the price of the electricity in my country. And also the price of household gas near to $0.7 per cube meter. Availability to electricity, 100% of urban population and near to 99.7% of rural population. And availability to gas near to 97% of total population, and energy intensity near to 0.33, 3 times more than the global average. You know, I think that these digits shown that the renewable energy development in my country is so difficult, you know. If I want to tell you about the potential of renewable energy in my country, you see in this picture that 90% of country has enough sun to generate solar. And more than 300 days of a year, we have a sun, and sunshine. More than 2/3 of Iran receive average 4.5 to 5.5 kilowatt hour per square meter per day radiation. It means that we have a good potential in the solar, energy, and also about the wind. You see in the picture. According to studies, country's technical wind potential is estimated to be more than 140,000 megawatt. And I think that this would be more than this, because this studies studied, for example, about 10 years ago. The share of all types of renewable energy power plants from renewable, you see at the bottom of the picture, more than, 1 gigawatt, 1.1 gigawatts. That majority of them is, composed from the, wind and solar. 33% from the wind and 56% from the solar. Totally more than 800 megawatts from the solar and wind, But the government wants to develop this kind of renewable energy to the 10 gigawatts during the next years. It has some goals and policies for this development. But about the topic of this panel, if I want to tell you that we transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, I think that it would have 3 phases. The first phase was about energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables. After that, we should promote industrial and technological capabilities in my country, and I will present you about this technological capability in my country. And after that, we can reach to renewable energy commodity export. It is not easy. I think it's so difficult because majority of our industries and our energy consumptions depends on the fossil fuels, and this transition is not easy. In this picture, that's from GILS 2007, shows that, in 3 levels, landscape level, socio-technical regime level, and niche innovations level, if we want to transit from fossil fuels to renewables, it's not, one dimension. We should work for 7, dimensions. The first one is markets and user preferences. The second one is industry, okay, policy, technology, culture, and science. And we should, pay attention to the landscape pressure, and we should promote and support the innovation technologies that are in the niche level, at the bottom of the page. If we don't promote and support these innovation technologies at the bottom of the picture you see, we cannot transit from fossil fuels to renewable energies to, shape the new socio-technical regime about renewable energy, especially wind and solar. And if we want to develop, renewable technologies in our country, we should focus on these technological innovation systems of the renewable energies. We should focus on these 7 functions: entrepreneurial activities, knowledge development, knowledge diffusion, guidance of the search, resource mobilization, especially financial resource mobilization, market formation. It's also, market formation in renewable energy in Iran is so difficult because of the price of fossil fuels and because of the very, powerful actor of fossil fuels. This market formation is so difficult, and also legitimacy, public awareness and something like that. You see in this picture our, targets of the government and also the policies of the government for develop renewable energy in my country. 4,500 megawatts solar up to 2026, and 3,000 megawatts of wind up to 2026. And we have some policies for the renewable development: FIT, auctions, and also renewable energy exchange. And we have a National Development Fund. They promise that, finance about $5 billion for, investment in renewable energy development. Also, we have good capabilities about wind turbine manufacturer in my country. You see 2 companies. One of them is MAPNA and another one is Sabaniru. The MAPNA now produce wind turbines 2.5 megawatts and wind turbine 4.3 megawatts of wind turbine. I think that is a good capability for, develop renewable wind technology in my country. And this is the roadmap of the industrial development about the wind turbines in my country, and I think that it would be, useful for export commodity of turbine. If I want to tell you about the value chain of the industry, my friend Mr. Fardat will focus on this value chain. They are one of the big companies in my country to develop whole value chain of the PV industry in my country, and there are some companies to develop whole value chain from the polysilicon, ingot, wafer, solar cell, and PV modules. And at the bottom of the picture, you see all the companies' name here, and this is the roadmap of solar industry technology development in my country in all kinds of the polysilicon, ingot, and wafer component and cell and modules. So sorry for my, presentation, and thank you for audience to this presentation. If you have any question, I try to answer to your question. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful, and we will have all of those questions. Of course, after we've got all the presentations. Mr. Fodor. And if I can just ask panelists to keep it nice and short, we'll have plenty of time for a conversation in the room.
Okay, in the name of God, would you please bring my presentation? I'm from Aras Silicon Industry. Our company is one of the companies who want to have the full value chain of the silicon, from the mine of the silica to silicon metal up to solar panels. My current presentation is about the opportunity and threats for energy exporting company based on the recent activity in the solar in the world. Okay, as I said, we want to have the complete chain of the solar panel from mine to solar panel, and we have a vision to have 20 gigawatt of solar panel per year, and also 40 gigawatt hours of battery in 2030, and we have a very I can say high milestone to have more energy than NIOC. NIOC is National Iranian Oil Company. We want to generate more energy in 2050. Okay, regarding the photovoltaic and lithium battery, in the recent years, we have some very, very special data. The first is that PV panel price now is very, very cheap. Maybe 1 year ago, it was double than the current prices. Now the prices is half of the last year, and maybe it's go down and down. And the new technology of the PV panels, bifacial panels, make more energy. And also the size of the panels grow. Now we have 700 watt panels. So it makes the capex of the power plant lower and lower. Please note, this change of the technology is just done in 2-3 years. Maybe 3-4 years ago, the modules was too smaller, and the cost was much more higher, and bifacial panels does not have a big market share, but now it's growing and growing every time. At the same time, we have some evolution and revolution in the lithium battery. LFP lithium batteries now are very good for storage of the energy, and also in the automobile we use LFP batteries. These batteries have more life cycle. In the commercial side, they have 6,000 cycle lifetime, and in the laboratories 10,000 cycle. And they are safer, so for many usage they can be used. And also the price is cheaper now for the battery. Also we have very fantastic prices, like 6 cents per watt hour for battery cell, and 11 cents for battery cabin. Based on all of this change in the industry, now the LCOE of a battery backup PV system can reach 3 cents per kilowatt hours, which is the key point of my current presentation. This LCOE, of course, needs some, for example, it's not possible in all over the world. It should be in the places that high radiation and high sun radiation, and also if we have a good finance. So, but with a good finance and with high radiation and the recent development in the solar panels, we can reach this number, which is very important. Regarding the electric car, also we know that the consumption of energy is much more lower than the normal cars, just 15 kilowatt hour for 100 kilometers, which is, it means if we can have 3 cents LCOE, so with just $0.50, we can go 100 kilometers. This is very important. So this is a treatment for the petrol countries, petrol exporting countries, oil exporting countries, because same car use 4.5 liters of petrol to go 100 kilometers. And also the maintenance cost of the electric cars is lower, except the battery, which and also another important issue is that the storage of the battery can use to cover the renewable energy instability. It is very important. Okay. Another issue is that the manufacturing of a solar panel needs too much energy. This is very important. In the chain, we need about 30 megawatt hours for silicon metal. I changed the number to megawatt peak. Actually, the real numbers is for tons, but I changed them to have a feeling about this issue. So we need 30 megawatt hours for silicon metal, 140 megawatt hours for polysilicon, 26 megawatt hour for ingot, and 56 megawatt hour for TOPCon to make 1 megawatt of panels. This is not all the data, maybe 20% more we need for other parts. So 1 megawatt of panel making need too much energy. At the same time, we need the glass for the panels and the aluminum, and these two also need too much of energy. We have another information that the price of the raw materials for a solar panel changed too much. We have, for example, $9 polysilicon, then reached to $45 per kilogram, now it's $8. So the price go up and down, and this is very important. So based on this opportunity, I believe one of the main things that oil and gas countries can have is to invest on the chain, and at the same time, if we invest on the full chain from the mine up to the solar panels, we can have the lowest risk and we can reach the goals that we want to have. This is very, very important. We have this in the oil and gas, in the 1970 decades. Some companies like Exxon, BP, they started from exploration of oil and gas up to the petrol station. So this strategy can be used. And we should have this strategy for a win-win strategy in the solar energy evolution. This is our plan in the Aras Silicon for reach the 20 gigawatt panels per year production capacity, and to have a solar farm in different parts of the world. So the time is limited. I don't want to stay more in these slides. This strategy can be a win strategy to transition from the fossil to the renewable energy, and at the same time exit strategy for the oil exporting company to the exporting raw materials or solar panels or solar energy as an alternative energy in the world. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, and it's of course exactly that revolution in solar PV cost that has enabled so much of what is to come. We're moving on to Gulf states. Dr. Manal Shahab.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with all of you today. And I want to start by talking about Gulf states, a little bit kind of building on from what Australia and the Iranian case has been. I want to talk first about diversification before getting into how green or clean energy could be a source of diversification. So the context for diversification in the Gulf states is slightly different than the other fossil fuel economies, because more than the other states, the Gulf region has had for long, I would say, an over-dependence on fossil fuels in government revenue, in exports, and also in overall economic activity. So while other countries have been more really diversified economies, the Gulf had for long, we've known that the imperative for economic diversification has been something that we've for long talked about, but it really wasn't until the decline of the oil price in 2014 when we've really seen an acceleration of the plans and the urgent need really appearing for policymakers. And we've seen a lot of changes as well for the first time, like reduction of energy subsidies that for long had been, the Gulf states for long had pretty much almost cheap or, dare I say, free almost water, which is desalinated with energy, of course, with electricity, but almost free water and energy in general. So that was kind of the first step. And then we've seen also the countries have had all these big visions, the economic development visions, which have seen a lot of expansion of different industries and different sectors in the region, yet until now, really, fossil fuel continues to be the main industry that really dominates, including in the more diversified economies like the UAE, for example. Now, the second point I want to move to is the opportunity for clean energy in the Gulf region. The region, just like Iran and a little bit like Australia, has amazing wind and solar resources, which means that renewable energy here can be produced at some of the lowest cost globally. And also, importantly, and this is an advantage that I think the region has over some of the other potential or some of the other fossil fuel producers as well, is that in producing oil and gas, it is a very low cost producer. So the region has some of the lowest cost cost of producing oil and gas. And that means that if we're looking at any potential clean energy sources that do include gas, for example, the cost of that will be lower potentially. So there's a comparative advantage as well, not only in potential comparative advantage in renewables, but also a comparative advantage in obviously fossil fuel and therefore anything that relates to that. And in addition to that, there's also geological advantages, which would also enable the region to capture or store a lot of the carbon that could be used or stored through carbon capture and storage technology from the oil and gas industry. And then probably the final thing to say as well is that in some of the regions, particularly in Saudi Arabia, for example, there is large land, of course, and the region geographically is quite nicely situated between Europe and Asia, so with trade partners that have existed for a long time, also offers really opportunity for trade for clean energy as well. And I will move to my third and last point, which is basically where are green energy and commodity export opportunities for the Gulf. Obviously, the first is indeed hydrogen. So all of the Gulf states, or most of the Gulf states at this point, do have hydrogen strategies. Really, the acceleration in renewable energy and hydrogen really came when the Gulf states announced net zero emissions. And this started with the UAE and then Saudi Arabia, which were announced at COP26 in 2021 in Glasgow. And then last year, also other countries followed, including Kuwait and Qatar as well, and Oman as well. For hydrogen strategies, for example, Saudi has one, Oman has one, the UAE just came up with one. We have NEOM, one of, I think, the largest at the moment green hydrogen project in Saudi Arabia, but also Oman has been predicted by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, to be the largest hydrogen producer here in the region by 2030. And because of the availability of renewable energy, it's also expected that the green hydrogen produced in the region will be also price competitive with other regions. And that at the moment, particularly with NEOM, that we've seen a lot of the investments going, this really represents a very large opportunity for exports. Part of this green hydrogen can also be then included in other industries like steel or cement. I worked on a project on looking at the assessment feasibility of green cement in Saudi Arabia, for example. And then the third and probably the biggest also export opportunity is really basically clean but not green. So it's really blue hydrogen, but also really exporting continuous exports of fossil fuel commodities with the carbon emissions really being a lot less through CCUS technology. And we've seen already blue hydrogen exports from Saudi Arabia to Japan in 2020, but also to Korea. And I think this is where we've seen it from all the region. This is where really the focus is on trying to really use carbon capture technology and its export potential and export goals. Thank you very much.
Plenty for our discussion that is soon to come. Chris Bataille.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. At the end of the day, I'm sure energies are starting to flag, and you're looking forward to a drink or something later in a few minutes. So I basically spent the last 5 years or so looking at the nuts and bolts of how do we decarbonize steel, cement, chemicals, and heat, and how do we do that as fast as possible. Demand for all of these things is going to increase for reduced iron, for clinker, for ammonia, for ethanol, methanol, jet fuel, what have you. And a lot of that demand is going to move. It's going to move to developing countries where much of the middle class of the world is growing. While most of these commodities can be electrified in the long haul, and by the long haul, I'm saying sort of by the 2060s, 2070s, the technologies are there, but they're mainly at sort of a TRL 2 to 4 level. There's going to be an extended mid-transition where we're still going to need to either they're going to come from fossil fuels, or we're going to have to find a way to make them with some sort of mixed fossil fuel and electrified methodologies. The fastest and cheapest way to decarbonize these sectors is probably going to be with application of CCS on concentrated CO2 flows. I'm not talking about post-combustion CCS, but where we rejig the processes so that a fairly 80-90% concentration of CO2 is coming out. You grab it, compress it, push it underground. This is only really feasible with a lot of cheap gas and geology for CCS, as Dr. Shahabi just mentioned. Coal is not great stuff for doing CCS. It comes in highly variable qualities with all sorts of contaminants. Generally, when we try to do CCS on it, it tends to foul sorbents and what have you, whereas we know how to do CCS and reforming of methane, especially autothermal reforming with partial oxidation. We know how to get concentrated streams of CO2 out of these things. Now, these facilities can be hybridized eventually with green hydrogen, with gasified biomass, and with direct air capture. It becomes possible. Very specifically, if you're looking at trying to make reduced iron, the reduction of iron is probably the single most GHG intense process that we do today. Basically, a gray syngas DRI facility is about half the emissions per ton of a blast furnace. First of all, just by moving to DRI, you cut the emissions in half. If you choose an autothermal reforming process over standard steam methane reforming, you can just literally bring up a pipe and attach it to the process and do CCS on somewhere between 60 to 100% of the process emissions coming out. If you design the facility properly, where there's space to put a heater afterwards, you can convert to fully green electrolysis-based hydrogen at the same facility with basically the same kit. So you start with gray DRI, gray hydrogen, gray syngas DRI, then you you can go to blue, or you eventually go to green. There's a lot of optionality value there, depending on how costs evolve for solar, for wind, for hydrogen, if you've got the local geology for storing hydrogen or what have you. Now, to do this, however, an absolutely clear-cut definition of abated is going to be required. 60% abatement of CO2 is not enough. We need to choose processes that produce pure streams of CO2 that we know that we can capture, compress and push underground. We need to hit that 90-95% capture rate, and it's got to be on low fugitive methane. So we have to apply the commitments that have been made in the last few days, and an 80% reduction of methane, the oil and gas charter, and we have to hold them to it. And this isn't something we can put carbon pricing on. It's something we need to monitor from well to processors. We need to run drones. We need, et cetera. If somebody's caught we need to end non-emergency flaring. If you're going to drill a hole, you should be required to bring a liquids and a gas pipe to the hole, collect all the liquid, collect all the gas. We shouldn't see big yellow plumes, big flares. A yellow flare typically means only 40 to 60% of the gas is being combusted. Methane is blue when it's fully combusted, and you typically simply don't see that on a flare. So we need that clear-cut definition of abated. So that's the higher level stuff. I've talked about steel a bit. Clinker, we're going to need CCS for clinker for quite some time for the process emissions. Ammonia, methanol, ethanol, these are all things with carbon content. We're going to want to go to progressively lower carbon content, start with waste CO2, ideally move to gasified biomass or direct air capture CO2 through time, but bringing that down. Methanol is probably going to win the race as shipping fuel, as a liquid. It's not as caustic and poisonous as ammonia if you dump it. There's going to be some sort of intermediate position. We're going to need a liquid synfuel as a shipping fuel, as a store of energy, what have you. Those are my comments from now, building off my colleagues, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Kalbecken here.
Stefan Kalbecken.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about Norway and the prospects for decarbonizing the Norwegian economy, and based very much, as Frank referred to, on the work of the Norwegian 2050 Climate Commission that I worked for 2 years. So first, let's do a little bit of background on the oil and gas dependency of the Norwegian economy. So petroleum made up about 14% of GDP in 2019, higher after that because the prices increased. in 2022, last year, was 74% of the export value of all Norwegian commodities. And the taxes on the petroleum sector made up 49%, almost half of all government tax revenues. So that speaks quite a lot to the oil dependence, oil and gas dependence, I should say, of the Norwegian economy. So then you can understand why these discussions on phased and phased out are going to be difficult in the Norwegian policy setting. Unsurprisingly, environmental NGOs, some of the greener parties, call for a oil and gas phase down, phase out eventually. Most of the discussion is centered on at least ending exploration, so trying to find new oil and gas reserves. The commission that I worked for recommended that we pause all further exploration until we have a plan for how to phase down oil activities in Norway. Politically, that was immediately shot down. It was dead on arrival because the sitting government, and not just the government, but all the major political parties in Norway agree more or less on the oil policy. I keep saying oil, but I do mean oil and gas. And the saying in Norwegian is that they should utvikle, ikke avvikle. It doesn't rhyme in English, but it means develop, not phase down the oil and gas in Norway. So what is meant then by these major political parties by developing the industry? Well, first of all, it's sort of cleaning up the production, so the extraction, I should say. That means electrification. Most of the power on the oil platforms is still by gas turbines. So electrifying that with power from land or offshore wind power is a key strategy. Parallel with that, developing CCS. One, so that you would have CCS on power plants in Europe, where most of natural gas is exported, but also potentially for producing blue hydrogen. And there is a fair amount of optimism surrounding blue hydrogen in Norway at the moment, mostly because of European plans for decarbonization, where hydrogen plays a key role. The EU might not want blue hydrogen, but if it isn't available as green, they'll probably buy that for the time being. So there's some visions of turning Norwegian oil and gas exports into blue hydrogen exports. Of course, heavily dependent on the cost of CCS and the scalability of it. Another related debate to how Norway could transition is using the technology and the expertise in the oil sector to become a powerhouse or something like that, also in things like offshore wind power, green shipping, which it's true. There's very high level expertise on offshore technologies, handling the rough marine environment. But with the profitability of the oil and gas sector, it's just impossible to attract the engineers. So the idea is that you have these green industries standing on the shoulders of the oil and gas industry. But when they're completely outcompeted in terms of salaries, you cannot attract those engineers to work in the green industries. So that's a major problem with the idea of using those technologies to transition into something greener. Third point, major point is that Norway is an energy-rich country also in the absence of petroleum. We have large hydro reserves, we have some great wind potential. We already have quite a sizable power-intensive industry, especially aluminium production. But there are also visions for expanding this through wind power, maybe some solar, but mostly wind, onshore and offshore, that you could use for expanding battery production, green hydrogen. But of course, there are conflicts surrounding this. One on land use. Wind power on land has been extremely controversial for the last few years in Norway because of the visual and ecosystem impacts. And then there's a real debate over what's the best use of clean electricity. Going the route via hydrogen is quite inefficient compared to direct electrification, so that's a major debate in Norway. But looking at this debate in Norway, so the developing, not phasing out of the oil and gas industry, focus on CCS, blue hydrogen, using green electricity for battery production, green hydrogen, etc. One thing that's striking is this idea that if you're phasing out eventually a polluting industry, you replace it with another energy-intensive industry. Based on Norway's comparative advantages, I'm not sure why we need to expand in energy-intensive industries. Why wouldn't it be biotechnology, medical technology, health, IT? There are so many other areas in which you could expand, but the idea seems to be you need to place industry with industry and remain an energy-intensive industry. So that's something interesting just about how this transition is thought about. It's transitioning into the same thing as you did before, just greener. I think that's enough by way of introduction for understanding the Norwegian policy discussions at the moment.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. We've got 25 minutes for conversation in the room. And please indicate to me if you would like the floor, and we'll get the microphone to you. Just as you're getting ready, I think we'll get the panel started on. Let's start on a big question, okay? And Stefan, you pointed out that this, getting away from fossil fuels is a difficult issue, even in Norway. If it's difficult in Norway, how difficult will it be elsewhere? Manal has a big essay in foreign policy on the shades of grey in the fossil fuel phase down and the importance of developing country interests in all of this. We've heard mention of CCS actually in several of the talks, blue hydrogen. Of course, anything that uses CCS is an additional cost. And of course, we've heard about the tremendous progress in renewable energy technologies, which oftentimes are now cost competitive, but not always. And so the big question I want to ask you all, guys, the respective countries that you work in, that you work on, that you live in, that you know about, is your estimation that the economies of those countries will be better off or worse off as a result of the global transition to net zero? Put you on the spot there, Fiona, first.
I would say for sure in Australia there is the potential to be much better off. I should say that I am an engineer by training, not an economist or a policy expert, but one of the things that is very clear in the discussion around this transition in Australia is that Australia hasn't done a great job in extracting value from its fossil fuels so far. They have not managed to share the benefit widely within Australia. The renewable energy industries could be a vehicle to change that and to really have the benefit of the energy industries that are happening in Australia come to the communities.
Jump right in, whoever wants to.
Okay. For Iran, I think that in the short term or medium term, it would be, it's not good for our economy, But for the long term, it would be useful for our economy. Majority of our industries and majority of our electricity generation was from the fossil fuels, especially gas. And this transition, and as now we under the pressure of the sanctions, and the technology transfer and financial transfer is so difficult for our country. Also, we have a good capability in wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, and also hydrogen. We have a good capability of hydrogen, especially in green hydrogen. But this transferring needs some, coordination between all actors of Iranian government, industries, and universities. I think that it would be so difficult in the short term and medium term, but in the long term, it would be useful for our economy.
Actually, regarding Iran, I think Mr. Mousavi said already. I agree with him. Thank you.
I think for the Gulf region, immediately for socioeconomic levels, if we exclude effects of the environment, of course, the global energy transition without any changes of the energy systems in the Gulf region is, I would say, detrimental to the region. It's actually very detrimental to the system, to the revenue sources, to the way what is often referred to as the social contract of, a lot of employment in public sectors and a lot of the jobs that are, or even industries that are basically linked to oil and gas. However, as we see a kind of adoption of potential opportunities of green energy or clean energy, I should say, in their system, as well as acceleration of diversification opportunities, I think we're starting to see that there is an opportunity for the Gulf states to kind of change a little bit. So we see, for example, a lot of youth, local youth working increasingly in industries that previously have been occupied by foreign nationals. So there's an opportunity then to kind of use the global energy transition to also achieve advancements locally. That said, I think there is a real worry that that the region will not be able to have sufficient green or clean commodity and energy exports to really kind of offset the losses of fossil fuel exports.
Yeah, so I'm going to offer two contrasting takes here. What will happen to global well-being, like just sheer productivity, and then what will happen to Canada, which is where I'm from. Once we electrify when you use electricity, it allows you to use energy to directly do the work you want to do. It has tremendous energy efficiency improvements, and I think it's going to have huge labor productivity impacts through time. As we make the full transition, you're going to see several percent. You're going to see a significant boost globally in terms of productivity. Now, and Canada will benefit from that. I do believe, and this is something that the econometric work has not been done, but it's a little too obvious that the growth of the oil sands in Canada has been very strongly associated with a decline, basically a flatlining of our productivity, and even a decline. We only have so much capital to allocate, so much labor to allocate. A lot of it has gone into the oil sands, and where we used to see a nice fast labor productivity growth, that's flatlined. And that's suspiciously associated with the growth of oil sands in Canada. In the long haul, we've got lots of hydro, we've got nuclear, we've got lots of biomass to work with. We have all the assets we need to benefit from the transition, much like Australia. And once we get, and the hydro and the nuclear provides an anchor for basically taking on as much wind and solar as we can possibly accommodate. Obviously, our solar installation is not great, but some regions, and specifically our oil and gas regions, have quite good solar insulation. Anything else I want to add to that? No, that's probably enough.
Well, Norway is currently pumping money out of the seabed, so it's going to be hard to find something that's equally profitable as that. Having said that, the expectation is that oil and gas production will decline over time because we're exhausting the reserves. So a fairly sizable decline is expected, irrespective of climate policy. And what Norway has done quite successfully is to manage that wealth for the common good. So the taxes on oil profits are somewhere north of 80%, 85%, I don't remember the numbers at the moment. In addition, the government owns around half of the major oil companies, so they take the profits from that as well. It's been placed in a sovereign wealth fund that currently stands at around $1,600 billion US. So even though you're not going to find something equally profitable, so it is going to hurt the economy. That income is projected to decline. We've converted most of the natural resource into financial wealth. So I think we're still well positioned for handling that transition. But I don't see, I'm not going to make the easy argument that there's a win-win there. It's going to be costful. It could cost Norway something to move away from fossil oil and gas production.
Stephen, I can certainly say that from an Australian perspective, we look with some envy to the institutional and governance arrangements that exist in countries that have effective sovereign wealth funds that are fed through energy resource rents. Colleagues, floor is open for questions. I see one here. Please do indicate to me, and we'll go around. Feel free to mention who you are, introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Mackenzie. I'm from Indiana University in the United States. We kind of touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you guys have any insight to how local communities or the general public have any power over the success of these initiatives that are currently being put on by the national governments?
I would like to jump in on that because what we're seeing in Australia right now is very much a slowing of the renewable energy rollout due to community backlash. So we've currently the major issues around rolling out transmission lines that we really need in Australia in order to continue our renewable energy transition. And we're seeing a whole lot of community backlash against that. It's just highlighting that you really, really need to be engaging very, very early with the community, communicating very well about why this is all necessary, what's going to happen, and make sure that you're not swooping in at the last moment. I would just say that the other side of that is we are starting to see, I believe the last number that I saw on the tracker was 14 renewable energy projects that have been announced or discussed in some form of collaboration with First Nations communities in Australia, and that is a fantastic thing that we are starting to see. So these are benefit sharing agreements where the First Nations communities sometimes have a stake, hold the risk and the benefit of these projects. So it's really something to watch, something that we need to be very focused on making sure that we get right.
Thank you for the conversation. My name is Abdullah. I'm from Harvard Business School, and I also come from Iraq. I'm curious for your thoughts. Iraq, for example, is a country where people live on the rent of oil, for example, like passed down through public sector jobs. Do you think there is a model in a post-energy transition world driven by clean energy, of which Iraq, for example, has like many like assets or potential for assets, where this like social model can exist? And how would you advise setting up a world where kind of the populace can continue to live off these like renewable assets, or like otherwise, what is the path forward?
Could I jump in on that? So I last year worked on a fiscal space analysis for Iraq to try to see, with the expected decline of oil price and oil exports, and even if the oil price goes up, but even with the oil export decline for in the future, what would that mean for the fiscal space, and then obviously what it would mean then for socioeconomic development funding, not just the energy transition. I think Iraq has, as you mentioned, a lot of assets, but also some political issues as well, as you know, with a lot of the oil and gas being concentrated in the Kurdish region. And then there is some political challenges for how then that wealth could then be kind of used for the region as a whole. But I do think that the difficulty for Iraq's situation, in addition to this political thing, is also the political challenge is also a financial one, with high debt, of course, and then also a lot of inefficient expenditures, I would say, and that fiscal space that I mentioned that is just decreasing and declining. So that means that for any investments to happen for clean energy, you would also either need to be very intentional over that, as well as potentially for that not to have trade-offs on socioeconomic development, then have more efficient government expenditures overall. But I do think Iraq is obviously very rich. It has a lot of assets, as you mentioned. Geographically also, it's got a lot of the really the advantages that both the Gulf and Iran have, the Gulf region. So I think the question on the social model, I think, is a long one, and I would probably, if that's okay, defer to answering it a little bit later. But I do think that at the moment, probably a lot of the lessons for Iraq are really to have the best of its energy system really requires other reform in other regions. But I know that Iraq is advancing significantly renewable energy, and that's a huge opportunity for it, both to reduce, whether it's to reduce flaring, but also to, there's opportunities for that are really massive, for energy security, of course, but also then I think the other focus Iraq has, which is depending on funding, is they're really interested in hydrogen, but that requires significant funds that, and obviously a lot of the funding might come from other regions as well that want to invest in Iraq.
I want to add some things. Thank you. I want to add some things. Economy of Iraq is so similar to Iran, because both countries depends on the oil export and gas, and all of the industries based on the gas and oil, I think that the oil and gas industries are resource-based economy, but renewable energy is so knowledge-intensive and technology-intensive And transition from fossil fuels to renewables has some preconditions for our countries. One of them is public awareness for the first time, especially among the policymakers. Policymakers maybe don't believe to these new energies, and fossil fuels regimes have a very hard resistance for changing and transitions. This is the first preconditions. The second one needs to high educated persons in all kinds of the sectors, and I think that Iran and Iraq needs to these high educated persons, and after that industrial and technological capabilities. Whenever your economy now exports oil and gas, and our economy. But I think that if we don't think about the technological development and industrial capabilities, also after some years we should import these equipments, but we should think about the technological development in our country, that it depends on the knowledge intensive, and after that you can think about this other phases of these transitions.
Hi everyone, Ian McGill from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. I confess I came late and I'm worried that you've already talked about this, so just feel free to tell me to sit back down and come on time. Just picking up on this point that Chris made and others, I think what we can safely say is a net zero world has less energy trade internationally, because renewables are much more justly and equitably distributed than fossil fuels turned out to be, and electrification has huge energy efficiency potential. Now you can talk about economic growth, we'll see. Things look to be falling a bit apart in that. But then it just does become a question, doesn't it, of who gets to export fossil fuels last, and just that ordering. And I've been thinking about that a lot with Australia right now. There's a lot of new gas development in Australia, and then there's East Timor, incredibly challenged and poor country. And I'm thinking, if anyone gets to do gas investment right now, surely it's East Timor rather than Australia, and surely it's not Norway, and surely it's not Canada, and surely it's not Australia. But here we have Colombia signing on to the Non-Fossil Fuel Proliferation Treaty when they've got a much better case to continue exporting fossil fuels than anyone else. And I'd just like to hear from the panel, unless you've already discussed this at length, what's the basis on which we turn off countries first?
Well, I want to answer that not based on my personal opinions, but just to give an insight into the Norwegian policy debate. So if you ask that question in Norway, most people would say Norway should be the last country. Of course, from equity reasons, everything else you'd think that's just insane. But that's the answer we get in Norway for two main reasons. One is that the oil and gas industry has been saying for decades now that they're most efficient in terms of having the lowest emissions from the extraction of oil and gas. Not sure it's no longer true, but that's been a major argument. So from an environmental perspective, they think it makes most sense to extract oil and gas in Norway because of low emissions. And as that's being challenged, if that's true or not, they moved on to saying, who do you want to give that income to, a democratic country or non-democratic countries? And that's another reason for keeping that income flowing into Norway. So again, carefully, not my opinion, but that's how the debate is framed in Norway. So I think that's interesting comparing that with more like principles based on equity and fairness.
It's on the end game.
Yeah, I'm just going to... Fossil fuels, specifically as a natural resource, can be a bit of a poison chalice if you're not careful, right? Because you get used to the natural resource rents, you start establishing a government budget based on them in public services and what have you. And, you know, as that carries on through time, if you don't take it and invest it, such as Norway has done, in other capital, and, you know, arguably Canada did that quite effectively. It started very much as a natural resources-based economy and then industrialized, and we still see ourselves as, you know, hewers, diggers of water, but 80% of our economy is services at this point in time. Most of it's high-tech. And even oil and gas is only 5% of our GDP at this point in time. But it does tend to take over your politics, and it does weird things to your currency. Like it can overinflate your currency relative to what your productivity really should be reflecting your productivity. So, you know, yes, it can be a bonanza if it's used properly for building capital, moving up the value-added chain. But if you get a little too addicted to it, it can do bad things to your long-term productivity and your long-term economic health.
So the former executive of the international arm of Kuwait Petroleum Company had said in public previously at a session that Kuwait will be the last, exporter of the last drop of oil. And I think this kind of reflects, I think, what the Gulf region really feels, partially because of the large reserves that they have, and also in part because it's very cheap to really produce. They're among the lowest producers. At the same time, you have in the region the challenge of domestic consumption, because the population is growing, heat, also with climate change, you need more energy, and it adds a pressure on energy efficiency. And if renewables don't accelerate to the targets, and they do have ambitious targets, then you're putting a pressure of how much then the consumption kind of taking over. But I do think the region has that in the vision, including in the vision of including CCS there, as we will continue, even if it's clean. But if we look beyond, the examples that you mentioned, there are also other countries, developing countries, that really still want to take advantage of their resources. So we might still see others saying, and this is what I think Frank was mentioning earlier, that in the foreign policy article I wrote, is other countries are saying, but we also want to have our chance at developing our countries using our natural resources. And I think the justice implication of the the energy transition might complicate things going forward as well.
I cannot resist just emphasizing an economic point at this stage regarding the end game, right? And you'd expect that we'll be riding down the cost curve, right? Until we're left with the remaining cheapest marginal cost producers, which will also mean lower fossil fuel prices, right? And so that competition, in a sense, will intensify between fossil fuels and renewables in particular as we ride down the cost curve. And that, of course, then also raises questions as to, whether OPEC, for example, will persist. We've got your question, and then probably yours will be the last. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Dennis. I work for the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and I'm based in Ghana. I mean, hearing all of you and sort of resistance and difficulty in developed countries that have benefited from fossil fuels having a difficulty in moving away, sort of transitioning. I'm wondering, for countries like Ghana in the Africa region, where initial investment into renewables is still quite high, and government will need to provide a lot of incentives from revenues that have competing demands in servicing other sectors of the economy and development. And also the energy poverty. There are still communities without electricity, and here we are discussing how clean the electricity would be when others just don't have it at all. I'm wondering, what would be your lesson? I mean, having gone through the mill, many of these countries, I know Norway since the 70s, I mean, you've been benefiting. I mean, Iraq, Iran, you've been benefiting. What's your advice to countries in Africa and probably Latin America where the potential exists? It may not be so much as yours, but it's significant to the economy. What's your advice in navigating this difficulty, given your own experiences as big boys within this industry?
Yeah, my question is to Dr. Minal. First of all, I think all other doctors here, very esteemed panel. My name is Harish Shahuja. I represent India's largest commodity and stock exchange, National Stock Exchange. And in many terms, this is much better than Nasdaq and in terms of transaction we do. My question, Dr. Minal, she said about exporting the hydrogen from the Gulf state to make them some kind of, moving from the fossil fuel. My question is, what kind of cost economies you have taken for blue hydrogen, which you're talking about? And have you taken, please tell me have you taken the transportation component of that cost? Because in India, we are aspiring to achieve $1 per kg by 2030. Don't you think that will be difficult for Gulf state to achieve, because $1 versus whatever your cost, and we have got economies of scale with us.
Is that blue or green?
Yeah.
Blue or green?
Sorry?
Blue or green?
I'm talking about blue right now.
Blue.
How about you?
Okay, so 2 more questions. And panelists, this is also your chance for any final words. We've got to wrap up in 2 minutes' time, so you each got like 2 sentences. Okay, so let's go.
I'm going to jump in here, and I'm going to make maybe a controversial statement that moving hydrogen around over the seas is not a great idea. You know, it leaks, it's low energy density, we have not built out an established way of doing that, what have you. If you really want to move hydrogen around, do it with low fugitive LNG, you know, for the time being, until we can transition away from it. To speak to the Nigerian fellow there, I've been working with Andrew Kamau at the Columbia Center for Global Energy Policy, and he's been telling me some astounding things that, you know, Africa has 120 gigawatts of installed diesel power, like that it's way more than what's actually consumed, like just meeting basic electricity needs. And at the same time, more gas, something like triple the amount of gas per oil produced, you know, associated gas is flared across the African continent. There is a moment, and at the same, and again, Africa's using about 1/5 the fertilizer it needs just for basic agricultural needs. So, like, there is a nexus of possibility here where the associated gas that is being produced can be used for electricity, it can be used for ammonia, it can help build industrialization in African countries. There is such thing as a responsible use of fossil fuels for developing countries moving forward, but it requires thinking about all the assets and setting up the incentive structure so that can be done. But I'll stop there and leave room for the panelists.
1 minute left. Please jump right in with your concluding comments.
I would like to just say I think there's a fantastic opportunity for Ghana and other African countries to leapfrog, to go into renewable energy straight away. And one of the wonderful things about renewable energy is it's very scalable. You can start small and just keep adding to it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Final point, I completely agree about moving hydrogen around as a hydrogen molecule. Terrible idea. Very happy to talk about the engineering reasons why, but I will leave it there for now.
While it is an opportunity to leapfrog Ghana and other countries, I think you need funding, and as you mentioned, these are competing priorities locally. And again, from a climate justice perspective, I think a lot of the funding has to be, potentially even a lot of the climate funding or the climate finance that's been talked about even at this COP. I think because otherwise, particularly for the energy poverty point you mentioned, it's cheaper to go fossil fuel, but obviously that's bad for the environment. So the solution should really be renewables, but you need, I think, external funding, whether it's in grants, things that do not add debt to the countries, as well as don't really have to make them choose between socioeconomic development on one hand and then renewable energy and electrification on the other. And for the question on India, so I did not do the maths on the blue hydrogen cost, but CAPSARC has, and I think they expect it will go down to $1.13 by kilogram in 2030. But the percentage of how much of the emissions will be captured is vague. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to discuss a little bit after, perhaps.
Colleagues, I'm getting a really hard wrap up here, so if you, seriously, like 1 sentence from each of the remaining participants. Panelists?
Well, if there's one lesson from Norway that's good and positive, it's that the resources and the resource rents should go back to the people, not to the companies. That's one thing we got right, and I think that's that idea we can export. We should maybe export less oil, but more of that idea of keeping the resource rents for the people and not for the companies.
Thank you very much for being with us for this event, and please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.